Hey guys, I'm back again, this time with another video I made for my psychology class. Once again, I'll be leaving the references down in the description, so please enjoy. Also, the entire video is spoilers, so be careful. Anyway, have fun. Enjoy! Hey guys, my name is Thomas Nguyen, and I chose to do my insanity defense video on Light Yagami, or Kira, from Death Note. So I'm sure if you guys watched anime around the late mid-2000s, wow, I can't believe that's a phrase now, you might know of a little anime called Death Note. It's famous for its thrills and chills and surprising plot twists. Before beginning this assignment, I had never seen an episode of Death Note. Growing up, I had heard my friends talking about it pretty often, but I never really got into it. Anyway, Death Note is about a genius 17-year-old Light Yagami who discovers a black notebook called the Death Note. This notebook is special in that any person's name that's written in this book will die. The person writing in the Death Note can even control how and when the person will die. Light goes on a killing spree starting with criminals on death row that are televised in Japan. To the public, these seem like a random string of deaths until ICPO finally decides that it's impossible for these deaths to be completely random, and as such conduct their investigation of these deaths in Japan. Because of the strange nature of this case, ICPO enlists the help of L, a genius who never shows his face and has solved countless unsolvable crimes in the past. The story of Death Note is the story of Light Yagami, or Kira, evading the law. Spoilers! He's eventually caught but never tried in a court of law. Light Yagami has killed countless criminals, and innocents alike. Some have estimated that it may be in the 6-digit range. Light has killed so many criminals that he has lowered the crime rate by 70%. If a serial killer were caught having killed the same amount of people that Light did, he would assuredly be put to death by a court of law. However, Light was never tried in a court of law. And I think, if he were tried in a court of law, there's a possibility he could be proved not guilty. And considering Light's intellect, it's almost assured. This is because of something called the insanity defense. The insanity defense is a defense used by people accused of a crime in which they state they cannot be held responsible for their illegal acts because they were mentally incapacitated at the time of the act. As a side note, the term insane isn't actually a psychological term, it's a legal term. The insanity defense has been used by defendants to be judged not guilty by reason of insanity. However, there are 5 rules that have been used to evaluate whether or not the defendant could use the insanity defense. And those rules are the McNaughton rule, the irresistible impulse rule, the Durham rule, the Ali rule, and the Insanity Defense Reform Act. The McNaughton rule is the first insanity rule. It states, the individual cannot be held responsible for a crime if the individual was so affected by a disease of the mind that he or she did not know the nature of the act he or she was committing, or did not know it was wrong. To paraphrase, the McNaughton rule states that in order to use the insanity defense, the person accused must prove that they have a mental disorder, and whether or not the mental disorder affected them to the point where they did not know what they were doing was wrong at the time of the crime. This rule came about during a trial in 1843 in which a Daniel McNaughton was tried for a murder of a prime minister's secretary. The jury judged McNaughton to be not guilty by reason of insanity. Due to the public outcry following the verdict, the House of Lords established what's known as the McNaughton rule. The next rule is called the irresistible impulse rule. A person could claim insanity if the person was driven by an irresistible impulse to perform the act or had a diminished capacity to resist performing it. This rule was first applied in Ohio in 1934. The most famous case involving this rule was in 1979. Dan White had assassinated San Francisco Board of Supervisors member Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone. Dan White argued that he had a diminished capacity to resist the impulse to shoot Moscone and Milk because of stress and consuming junk food. This was later dubbed the Twinkie defense in reference to the junk food. The Durham rule broadened the criteria for insanity. In 1954, the case Durham versus the United States produced the Durham rule. The rule states that the insanity defense could be used if the crimes were the product of mental disease or mental defect. However, this rule was dropped by almost all jurisdictions by the early 1970s. It might have been due to the fact that the rule allowed defendants to claim presence of any disorder recognized by mental health professionals as the cause of their crimes. The Durham rule also didn't require defendants to show that they were incapacitated by their disorders. The Ali rule, proposed by the American Law Institute in 1962, states, a person is not responsible for criminal conduct if at the time of such conduct, as a result of mental disease or defect, they lack substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of their conduct or to conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. The term mental disease or defect does not include an abnormality manifested only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. In the case of Barrett versus United States, in 1977, the rule added that temporary insanity created by voluntary use of alcohol or drugs does not qualify the defendant for acquittal by reason of insanity. One famous case the all-lead rule was used in was the John Hinckley case. John had a diagnosis of schizophrenia, and his defense attorneys successfully argued that John couldn't understand the wrongfulness of his shooting of Ronald Reagan. They found that John had sent letters to Jodie Foster, an actress John was obsessed with. From these letters, they found that John had committed the act under the delusion that it would impress Jodie Foster. The Insanity Defense Reform Act, or the IDRA, was enacted by Congress in 1984, and states, "A person with a criminal offense should be found not guilty by reason of insanity if it is shown that, as a result of a mental disease or mental retardation, they were unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct at the time of their offense." So let's talk a bit about Light Yagami. Before obtaining the Death Note, Light Yagami seems to be an average high school genius. He's clearly the smartest in his class, and later he manages to enter a top university with the best score on the entrance exam. On top of that, he seems to be extremely sociable and wanted by all the girls in his class. So all seems quite tame and normal until one day, Light Yagami finds a black notebook on the ground. He quickly finds out that this black notebook is called the Death Note. As I mentioned earlier, Light Yagami finds out about the powers of the Death Note and begins killing criminals. When interrogated by the Shinigami, a Death Reaper and the original owner of the Death Note, Light reveals that even though he knows he can control people's deaths to make it look like an accident, he specifically kills criminals with heart attacks as a signature. He says that he wants the world to acknowledge his existence. He states that he wants people to know that there's someone out there watching and judging their actions. When asked why pass judgment on strangers, Light simply says he was bored. He goes on to say that he wants to cleanse the world of rotten people, claiming that he will create a new world, and he will become the god of the new world. The grandiosity of the previous claims lead me to believe that Light likely has narcissistic personality disorder. This would explain his need to have the world acknowledge him, as those with narcissistic personality disorder seek the approval of others. Although in his regular life, outside of using the Death Note, Light doesn't actively seek the attention or approval of others. Those with narcissistic personality disorder tend to hold shallow and exploitative relationships with other people. This is seen throughout the anime. Light, on multiple occasions, dates women in order to throw off the investigation, whether to give himself an alibi, or in the case of Misa, a tactical advantage over L. His relationship with Misa is a textbook example of how a narcissist treats others. Misa is madly in love with the idea of Kira and finds out that Light is Kira. He hates Misa and constantly ignores her wants and needs. He also demands total obedience from Misa and exploits Misa to gain an advantage over L. It's important to note that Misa has access to another Death Note. Misa made a deal with a Shinigami named Rem. She is able to see a person's lifespan and name simply by looking at their face, but she had to give up half of her remaining lifespan. This is an important fact because L, the detective chasing down Light, doesn't reveal his face or name. He constantly exploits Misa's almost obsessive love for him to control her and to gain an advantage over L. Light seems to belong to the grandiose type of narcissism, given that he engages in grandiose fantasies, is arrogant, manipulative, and exploitative, and engages in criminal behavior. At one point in the anime, he tricks two FBI agents into revealing their identity, allowing Light to kill them with a Death Note. At the end of the series, when Light is finally caught, we suddenly see him become extremely aggressive, which falls under grandiose narcissism. With the idea that Light has narcissistic personality disorder, subtype grandiose narcissism, this would qualify Light to use all of the insanity rules that specify that the defendant must have a mental disease, defect, or disorder, which include the McNaughton rule, the Durham rule, the Ali rule, and the IDRA. Considering the McNaughton rule, Light likely wouldn't be able to use this rule, as the term disease of the mind can mean many things. Courts are more likely to accept a mental disorder that can distort one's perception of reality, like schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders. Also, Light seems to have a sense that his actions are against the law, otherwise why would he go to such lengths to avoid the law? Now, looking at the Durham rule, Light would likely be able to use this rule given that he can blame the cause of his actions on narcissistic personality disorder, as it is a disorder recognized by other mental health professionals. However, because Light was caught in 2013 or 2010 if you're going by the manga, and seeing how the Durham rule is no longer used as of 1970, it would be impossible to use his rule. Upon first reading the Ali rule, I thought Light could use his rule because he has narcissistic personality disorder, and in some ways sees his actions as justified because in his eyes he is cleansing the world. The rule also requires that the defendant must be able to conform their behavior to the requirements of the law. This is a bit interesting because there was a period in time in which Light had to relinquish the Death Note, and by the rules of the Death Note, he would lose all memories related to it. During this time, Light showed no desire to kill. If Light were tried during this period in time, he might be able to use the Ali rule, as he would be able to conform his behavior to the law. However, the Ali rule has a specific stipulation that would disqualify Light, and it's this line here. The term mental disease or defect does not include an abnormality manifested only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. Because of his repeated killings, this would conflict with the Ali rule and disqualify Light. But what about the IDRA? It doesn't have the stipulation that the Ali rule has and doesn't require the defendant to conform their behavior to respect the law. Light seems to kill in order to get acknowledgement from others, which would qualify him for this rule, as the killings would be a direct result of a mental disease, narcissistic personality disorder. And because he believes that he is in the right for cleansing the world of its evils, it would seem that he doesn't quite appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. The fact that he avoids the law could possibly disqualify him for this rule. However, this rule specifically uses the word wrongfulness and not criminal or unlawful. There is a possibility that a lawyer could argue that there is a difference between a wrong behavior and an unlawful behavior. If they could successfully argue this, it's likely that Light could plead not guilty by reason of insanity using the IDRA. One last rule we have yet to discuss is the irresistible impulse rule. Compared to the other rules, this seems to be least applicable to Light's case, seeing as how Light is killing others to gain attention of the world. However, this might only help his case to use this rule. There was a period in time, like we discussed earlier, in order to hide his identity as Kira or as the person doing the killings, he had to relinquish ownership of the Death Note. But once he regained his Death Note and in turn regained his memories of the Death Note, he immediately killed the previous owner of the Death Note and immediately resumed killing criminals. It would seem that the Death Note enables people to kill but also diminishes one's capacity to resist killing. Light himself admits that the Death Note must have some supernatural power that makes the user want to try to use the Death Note. Throughout the series, there are other people who come across other Death Notes, and all of which engage in killing people or criminals. With this in mind, there's a strong argument that the Death Note can diminish one's capacity to resist killing others. So it seems that Light Yagami could realistically take advantage of 3 out of the 5 insanity defense rules. However, Light is a Japanese citizen, and he was caught in Japan. The rules that I just explored are all used in American courts of law, and Japanese courts of law are different when it comes to the insanity defense. Some principles are similar, in that if the defendant isn't able to fully understand his actions or be able to appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions, like in the Ali rule or the IDRA rule, then they can be acquitted by reason of insanity. But I cannot speak on Japanese law. If Japanese law contains similar stipulations to use the insanity defense like the Ali rule or the IDRA, then it's likely that Light would be able to use these in the Japanese court of law. However, usage of the insanity defense is rare in Japan. It's estimated to be about 1 in 500,000 cases, which is somewhat similar to the US. Also keep in mind that even though one can use the insanity defense to avoid a guilty verdict, not every defendant that uses the defense walks free. At least in the US, only about 1% of cases that use the insanity defense rule have the defendant walk free. In the other 99% of cases, the acquitted are given treatment, sent to mental hospitals, given conditional release, or are assigned to outpatient care. Even if Light would be declared not guilty by reason of insanity, he would most likely be sent to a mental hospital or given conditional release. He is way too dangerous with the knowledge of the Death Note, so it's likely that the court would release him with the condition that he relinquish the Death Note, and as such would lose all memories of the Death Note. If he showed any signs of a mental disorder even after losing the memories of the Death Note, he would likely be assigned to outpatient care or sent to a mental hospital. Alright, so that's going to do it for me. Thank you guys for watching. And, whew, wow. Death Note was a wild ride. I really enjoyed it for the most part. The anime was filled with lots of twists and turns until the very end, and it was really fun to watch. Death Note has sort of a weird place in my life in that it's sort of this legendary anime that everybody except me has watched, so I'm glad that I was finally able to watch it all the way through. Anyway, if you guys like psychological thrillers, I would actually recommend watching the anime. It's 37 episodes of non-stop thrills and chills. Anyway, that's gonna do it for me. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.